Now, people probably remember it as just St. Peter's Parish. There is some debate on what the official name is. A lot of paperwork over the years changes from Peter and Paul to just St. Peter, but in the church, on a stone, I believe, above the door when the church was built, it said St. Peter and Paul. So I believe that is the name. That was a mission center in an area called the Big Spring Settlement, because there really wasn't actually a town there quite yet. It was under the Order of the Precious Blood, and it focused on the immigrants from Luxembourg and Belgium. They had their own traditions, so they focused there. At first, it was just a frame church, and then they built a brick church there, and you can see in the picture that there was also another building there. I believe that was a school at one point. I don't know the date of this picture, but I just love, you can see how tall that steeple is. It's just really something to look at. Also, you have St. Nicholas being founded. Formed in 1855 for the French-speaking population. As I said, people were in that larger Confederation of German states. On the western side of that were a lot of French-speaking people. So they came here. They did speak German, a lot of them, but it wasn't their native language. They really liked to have Mass in their native language, and they had their own customs. So they formed their own parish only a few miles away. Now there's always a story going around in our community of asking the bishop to build the church, and it was too close to St. Boniface, so they got the bishop on a wagon and they took him on kind of a wild goose chase. They took him down 587 and down into McCutcheonville and through the woods because it's wilderness, and then maybe over to Adrian, and they made it a real long path. And then when they got there, he finally said, "Oh, this is so far away that we have to build a church," when really they didn't do a straight line. Now, other versions of the story is maybe they were enjoying themselves as they took that long path, and they got into the holy wine. Whatever version you like, the church was built. It was only a few miles away. It was first a log cabin, and then they built the brick church there in the late 80s, in 1889. On the right-hand side is a cover of a book that was just written a few years ago by Reverend Jamie Matthias. He's a native of the area, and he wrote this book. It's a lot of history in this book. I have a copy of it up front, and it is available on Amazon if you are interested in Frenchtown itself. This is volume 1, so it's from 1900 and before. Last I spoke to him, he was going to write the volume 2, which is the rest of the history, and he was also interested in writing a book for St. Peter's, but I'm not sure on that. There'd be a lot of history there as well for a book. Back to St. Boniface, as we said, funds were tight for them, so in 1857 they finally had the funds to build a brick tower, brick bell tower, and they replaced that smaller wooden chapel. 200,000 bricks. Now they probably would have had a kiln close by, or it would have been shipped in on train. But there was no train station in New Riegel at the time, so it would have been actually in Berwick. They would have had parishioners take their carts to Berwick, get it off of the train depot, and then bring it into New Riegel. Bells were purchased, and they bought a pipe organ there. So it's really turning into a proper church now. You have a big bell tower, you have the organ. But that wasn't all that they built. The Sisters of the Precious Blood built a new building, a brick building, and it would have been a boarding house for girls, and they took in orphans. This building would have been separate from their Marietta Crib residence that they took over in 1844. This would have been just for the girls. They quickly outgrew their log cabin, so they built their own brick convent in the 1860s. Then a new brick school in 1862. And this whole time, the records aren't really clear of where the priest and the brothers were residing, because the first record that I can see of a brother's residence is in 1864, and they actually built a U-shaped house across the street. So if you're familiar with the area, St. Boniface is all on the west side of 587. On the other side of it would have been this here, would have been a U-shaped structure for the brothers. The left-hand side of the screen is a drawing, a rendering of it. On the east side would have been a picture of it. Now in later years, I'm not sure if that became a private residency or not, but it was around until 1905 at the latest. Now this is a picture that I had found of the entire St. Boniface complex, I'm going to call it, because you have so much going on here. All the way to the left, you'll see the churches. You have the smaller church being the original. You have the bigger church being the first brick church that they have. The top of the map, you'll see two barns and a garden, and actually you can see a cemetery kind of enclosed there. The Precious Blood, the sisters, the brothers, they were a self-sufficient community. So those barns would have been part of their farming, their harvesting, probably raising cattle, any number of different things. In the center you'll see the washroom and the orphanage. We talked about just a few slides before. Kind of in the center left, I should say. You have the sisters' residence, you have the original residence that the sisters had, the Mary at the crib there in the center, and on the right-hand side you had their new brick convent that they built there in 1862. Across the street then you have a very small little building. That's a private home. But all the way to the right, the bottom right, that is where the priests and brothers lived that we had from the previous slide. In this picture, it's not a U-shaped structure, it doesn't appear, but that would have been their house there. That brings us to 1864, and they did a beautification at the cemetery. Now you can see that this picture is in color. I took this just a few days ago. This is not historically from 1864, but the chapel still stands. They called it the Mother of God Chapel, or in German, it would have been the Mutter Gottes Kapelle. Mutter Gottes Kapelle. Around it, they built Stations of the Cross around the perimeter of the then cemetery, which you can, if you had an aerial view, you can kind of see where that would have been just by the layout of the cemetery. And it was the only cemetery in the diocese that had such a display. The stations were removed in 1898 due to poor condition. Now, a good story about this that I love is that it was built in 1864. Major event in American history is a civil war would have been going on at that time. There is a native of the parish, I believe it was Joseph Bohr, who served in the Union Army. And the legend is that he was in heavy fighting in the Battle of Chickamauga, which was just a terrible battle. And he pleaded with God to save him. And he promised that if he survived the war, that he would purchase the cross for this chapel. He indeed did survive the war, and he donated $50 back in 1864 for this event, or this building. And that brings us to the building of the second church, the church that we know currently of St. Boniface. Started in 1875. It was 130 feet long, 50 feet wide, the original plans, with a spire topping it. So you have that just like we have the St. Peter and Paul picture that I pointed out. It's a very tall steeple, what actually would have been called a spire, up to 200 feet tall, which would just been amazing accomplishment to build that with no cranes or anything. It would have been just a series of levers and a lot of bravery to get up there. The original plans, because of how wide the church was to have pillars on the inside as support beams. The church then was actually, the plans were reduced, the width was reduced, so the pillars were no longer needed. Much like when they built the other chapels, parishioners had to haul the product, the building materials from Berwick. A lot of the wood that they used was sourced locally, because it was a wilderness. So a lot of hard work from the parishioners themselves. The cornerstone, which is pictured there, was laid in 1875. The building was completed in 1878. Now, if you look closely at the name, it doesn't quite look like St. Boniface, does it? Well, for the longest time, I thought it was German. So I learned how to say that in German. St. Boniface in German is Heiliger Bonifacius. The problem is when I looked into it more, that's not German either. That's actually Latin. Latin, let me try to think of, I tried to learn that just today to refresh my memory. Sanctus Bonifacius. Something close to that. I probably butchered it, but that is actually Latin. It's still there today. It's on the side of the road. If you're entering the front, from the front of the church, it's on the right-hand side, so it's kind of obstructed a little by some guardrails because there's a ramp there now, but it's still there, still in very good condition. One of the things I love about our church there in New Riegel is the windows. There's 17 windows were put in, just these huge, huge panes of stained glass. And there we have a listing of the people who donated towards those windows to put them in, and their names are usually on the bottom, either their names or in memory of someone. And you can see the prices of those windows, $75 for a huge window. Now, isn't that just amazing to think that's, in our world, you think that's all it costs, but $75 would have been a lot back then. And as I said, when I opened that, families have been there for generations, you'll see a lot of the familiar names. I see a boar there, a Schalk, a Gase, there's another Schalk, a Kelbly, but spelled a little differently. There's Huss. There's a lot of familiar names that you'll see. Well, the brick convent that they built in 1862 became too small again. They started to outgrow themselves, so they built another building. They actually tore down part of the existing one that they had, and they built in addition to it in 1892 and 1894. And this is a drawing of that. Now, this building would have been the one that we would be familiar with it if you're a person of a certain age, and for New Riegel, it would have been either the convent at that time, or later on it becomes something else, and we'll get into that. But that is a picture of it. And in the background to the left, you can see another smaller chapel. That's the cemetery. If you get a good quality picture, which it's a little tough on this one, it's a little grainy, you can see that there's a fence real close to that small chapel. That's that fence we talked about earlier that had the Stations of the Cross. When they tore down the old portion of the convent, they had all that extra material, all those old bricks, so they actually made a grotto there on their property in honor of Lady of the Wards. I had a picture of that, but it wasn't a very good picture, and when I put it up on the size of this screen, it became very grainy, so I couldn't use it. But they did not let that material go to waste. That brings us here to an individual, Mr. Schaefer, I believe. He was a teacher there at the parish school from 1866 to 1896, so 30 years. He was the teacher, and he was also the organist for a long time. So much so that they actually put it on his stone. That is a picture of his headstone, which is still there in the cemetery. I took that picture just a few days ago. It is in the second row of the old section. The cemetery is split up into 3 distinct sections, divided by a paved path for cars to go in. So the part that's northernmost is the old section. That's anywhere from the 1830s to about the 1920s. So he's in that second row. You can see that stone still. Well, troubling times happened for the parish. U.S. faced a financial depression, which was not quite as bad as the depression in the 20s, late 20s and into the 30s, but it was pretty bad. Estimated unemployment for the nation was 18.4. So the parish took a hit. The people just were not able to donate like they had in the past. So the parish started actually running out of money, and they actually had to at times borrow money